how big of a threat is China? There seems to be this consensus really in both parties that they're 10 feet tall.
China has a lot of its own problems. They have a housing issue that's pretty serious right now. The aging issue is a major issue. You can't really fix that.
The Chinese Communist Party commits abuses of Uyghur minorities. It's a huge surveillance state.
It is slave labor that's happening. So how do we deal with that? 下周二我要去上海.
That's such a good flex. Welcome to the World and Stuff podcast. Super excited today to have John Helveston on the show. We're going to talk about renewable energy and EVs and China policy and all kinds of interesting stuff. But first, John, tell the people why they should listen to what you say.
Sure. So, hi, everyone. John Helveston. I'm an assistant professor at George Washington University in engineering management and systems engineering. And I've been studying China's EV industry, primarily EVs, but also renewable energy for quite a while. Going back to around the Olympic times, my first trip to China in 2008. I spent some time there. I worked for GE in wind power there, and then went back for my PhD in public policy and engineering. So the areas of sort of renewable energy, electric cars, these are all very policy-driven sectors. And for obvious reasons, we need to address climate change. That's the underlying reason. So it's kind of important that you look at both the technology and the policy and how this is all playing out. And this is what I've been focused on. It's what I did my dissertation work on. At Carnegie Mellon, I focused on China's EV sector. And now at GW, I still continue to focus on research in this area, policy, and getting to a sustainable energy future.
And you've been to China many times and speak Mandarin?
Yeah, so like I said, first trip was 2008, back as a young undergrad and naive about the world, and have spent a lot of time there working in different sectors, different ways, and went back and forth many times, also as a PhD student doing field research there. And I do speak Mandarin reasonably well.
Give us some Mandarin.
So Chinese listeners are going to critique me. 下周二我要去上海. That was not pronounced well.
That's such a good flex, though.
As of next week, I'm going to Shanghai, which is true. Next Tuesday, I fly out.
Awesome. Let's. I want to start by taking a step back. Let's take like a 30,000 foot view. I assume because climate change is such a consequential issue, and we are facing such devastating challenges from climate change that across the world we have come together and really making progress on finding a way to net zero.
So, are you asking for what's the grand plan here? Like, how are we going to solve this problem? Are we
moving in a direct, considering the enormity of the problem at hand, are we moving in a direction that eventually gets us where we need to be to stave off the worst of it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say globally, there's been some promising things in the last decade or so, for sure. I think we have the tools we need to get there. I think whether we get there, I think we're going to get there, but it's more of a time question. Like,
right.
How soon will we get there? Will we solve it in the next decade or like 2 decades or 3 decades? And I think those answers are going to be more based on policy and politics than the actual technology. I think we have a lot of pretty good tech that we could use today and could get us a majority of the way we need. There are some sectors, though, that we still don't have solutions for, like aircraft, for example. Like jet fuel is just really energy dense and really important, and it's hard to solve that problem. So we do need technological innovation, but we're on our way. I think we have a reasonably good set of plans to get there.
Speed is the key, though, right? Like, in order to stave off the worst of it, we need to get there fast. And so, like, can we get there fast enough to save ourselves from burning and drying and not being able to feed ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, those are all, they sound dramatic, but they're all like very real. Global famine, for example, is something that people are pretty concerned about. So long-term risks. So yeah, speed is a challenge. I think some of the things that we could do really quick, we've kind of already gotten there, especially in the energy side. So a lot of the cost of cleaner technologies has fallen dramatically in the last decade or so. So we're getting to a point where solar power is today already the cheapest form of new power. It's way cheaper than most fossil fuels. So you've already got a point where it kind of just makes sense to buy that. We don't need as much policy as we need just rapid growth. So that's like really good news. I think that we're pushing there. But of course, these things politics are engaged in all of this, and I think that's the thing that might slow us down or not get us there as fast as we possibly could. I think we could be going a lot faster than we are. And especially over the last 10 years, we could definitely be further along than we are today without issues with international politics.
Because like in order to meet our goals, the scale of production that we need to do on solar panels is like crazy. I read something where in order for like China, for instance, to meet its goals, it basically has to produce what we have now in all of North America every year for the next 30 years. And I know that the build out in the United States has to be like almost unimaginable scale.
Yeah.
But I guess the question is like, how do we get there?
Yeah. So the scales are like I said, like the tech we have already today is arguably good enough. It's just a matter of deployment. Like, can we deploy it fast enough to meet the challenge here? So scale up is what we need. My opinion, I think one of the fastest ways is to trade with each other around the world. Find the places that are making these things the best, the fastest, and at the lowest cost, and trade with them and buy their product and deploy it. But others disagree with that. So this is a huge point of tension right now, and so maybe we can talk about this. Of the clean tech that we have today, wind, solar, and let's say batteries, and often what they go into, electric cars, the vast majority of all of those are made in China, and the entire supply chains of those are all concentrated in China. And so this is making it now a global sort of political football for international politics, namely between the U.S. and China, but also Europe and China. U.S. policymakers are really concerned of that concentration. Some are calling it a national security risk. I don't necessarily see that as the risk, maybe. But the bigger risk I think that policymakers are concerned about is job concentration in China and job loss, potential for job loss. So I think it really comes down to jobs is the concern, which is not something to ignore, right? So we've had a history in the U.S. of losing manufacturing jobs to China in a lot of important industries. And that history hits home and hurts, especially in certain communities where it's really concentrated. So they've struggled from that. But now we kind of face this different challenge where the question is, like, do we have the luxury of time to kind of like adjust this? I mean, if we had no climate change, I would just be like, let's just industrial policy this thing all day. Like, let's just tariff everything up and just make it all here. And who cares if it takes decades, to get there? Doesn't matter. But we don't really have that time. So this is the trade-off that we're trying to like thread the needle on, I think, is how can we get to a green future that doesn't necessarily like decimate U.S. manufacturing in certain areas. And so I think the answers to that depend on which area we're talking. Like the answers will be very different, I think, for solar versus EVs and batteries. And so I can get into more on each of those.
Let's get into that. But I guess it would, I think, behoove us to, we have to kind of discuss like how big of a threat is China to the United States. Like that's kind of what we're getting at right. And there seems to be this consensus really in both parties that it's a huge threat and they're 10 feet tall and they're going to have a better economy and a better military than us. So we better like look inward and take the sacrifice that it's going to take in cost to produce these technologies at home. That's maybe like the view from Congress. But then you hear people like Peter Zehan and others who are saying that, in 10 years, the demographics of China are going to collapse. Yeah. And so like if that's the true scenario, and I honestly think that kind of thinking is becoming more prevalent in the national discourse, that China is on a downward spiral demographically and therefore won't be able to compete long term. And so like in that scenario, it would seem to me that there's less of a worry and maybe we could lean into buying some rather inconsequential products from them when it comes to...
Yeah, I think I'm probably on that spectrum. That's a pretty big spectrum. I'm a little bit closer to that China has a lot of its own problems to solve, which is a way of putting it. Like, they have a housing issue that's pretty serious right now, and it's been kind of growing for the last decade, and that's a big issue. It's like an oversupply problem. It's the opposite of what we have here. And so they have other long-term economic issues that are going to be a constant drag on China's economy. So the aging issue is a major issue. You can't really fix that. I mean, if young people aren't having kids, so which is what's happening. So there's some pretty serious things that the government over there is trying to address and are really struggling to find answers. People in the West have provided suggestions, but they're not necessarily taking them for different reasons that I don't even know. People have come up with all sorts of reasons of what's going on in Xi Jinping's head, but he's not pursuing some of those strategies. So yeah, I don't see China as huge a threat as I think a lot of people maybe perceive it to be. We have been extremely successful trading partners for the last 30 years. It's not all been wins, like I said. There are places where we have lost jobs, and at the same time, our economy is doing pretty darn well. And again, if you look at the latest top cutting edge research in a lot of other sectors, we're still leading it. Like AI and machine learning. This has pretty much come out of U.S. industry or U.S. universities and now U.S. industries. So there's just a number of things. You can just riddle off these really high tech, high value add, extremely expensive research enterprises that are going on in the U.S., which is still our kind of backbone of what makes us kind of a center of the world in a lot of core technologies. When I look at what China's doing very well, it's still manufacturing. This is kind of what they've historically done, and manufacturing is a way to grow up the sort of global economic value chain to become a global player. And we've seen that success in a lot of other countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and so this is the question: will China ever get past this phase? And I'm not so sure. They're extremely good at manufacturing very mature technology, and solar and batteries and a lot of these things are, I would put in the category of extremely mature technologies. They've been around for decades. If you want them to make something brand new that's cutting edge, high tech, it's harder. They don't have the same institutions set up for that like we have. So I've always seen that as our kind of mutual strengths and weaknesses, and I think that largely kind of works in our favor to use their manufacturing capabilities and capacity to help us succeed. And I mean, there is a limit, I guess, to at some point, and this is I think a lot of this recent pushback against China has come out of COVID. The recognition that we had huge vulnerabilities during COVID, we couldn't even make plastic gloves because we didn't have any manufacturing capacity for that. And so people kind of freaked out that, hey, if we can't trade with China during this period, we're kind of sunk. How are we going to deal with this? So there is some value to having some nascent manufacturing in the U.S., and maybe we've gone too far in a spectrum and we need to pull some of that back. But I think there are some sectors where I don't think it makes a lot of sense to even really try to compete. And I think there's other, maybe we can just talk about solar as my one example here, where I don't really think it makes a lot of sense to try to compete in manufacturing of solar inside the U.S. It's an extremely competitive sector. The top 10 players are all in China. Margins are super, super thin. I mean, it is an industry where it's very hard to make money. And the actual number of jobs is not that high. Most jobs in solar is downstream, in installations and financing, just getting the projects built and working out the balance of system with the grid and things like that. That's where there's most jobs. And those jobs cannot be outsourced because you have to physically be on someone's roof, right? So trying to just build up manufacturing facilities to just have solar here, to me, is a bit of a question mark. What's the real value of that? We're not necessarily going to get a ton of jobs. We're going to have a really hard time competing on cost. And it's not like China's the only place in the world. There are other countries that are also making panels that we can buy from. So my thinking is maybe we should just boost up their industries, go over to the State Department and come up with a multilateral strategy here to find other nations that are allies with us and say, why don't we help them with their manufacturing capacity? We'll let them continue to control that, and we'll buy from them. We do exactly this with our phones, by the way, and no one seems to have a problem with that, which to me is a bigger national security threat. Your phones have all of your information on them. Solar panels are just pieces of silicon that you stick on your roof and make power for 20 years.
That's a super profound example of a little bit of ridiculousness, right? Because everybody in this room and all that's listening to this podcast have a Chinese phone in their pocket right now with their most personal details on it. But God forbid we have a solar panel on our roof that's basically dumb technology.
Simple technology, right? I mean, we don't there's other things.
It's not going to be able to spy on you.
No.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of there's. So I don't see it as a threat. So I think that the energy security threat is a real thing. But I kind of just flip the question on its head. I'm like, well, how secure is our current energy system? I mean, we had a pipeline go down in like South Carolina or somewhere in the South a few years ago. I remember this. It was like right before COVID, and the world just like panicked for like 3 days. It was just utter chaos. Gas prices spiked. I mean, like, we are so vulnerable to like very small timescale disruptions. Any conflict in the world shoots off, and all of a sudden we're stuck in a pretty insecure situation in our current fossil fuel based system. If you have renewable energy, there's no fuel. You just put the things on your roof, or you put wind turbines out there, and you get power. Not all the time, all right? The sun doesn't shine all the time, but we have storage, we have batteries, we have hydropower, we have other ways of balancing the grid, and we produce the power here without fuel. Fuel is the vulnerability.
Right, so it's a little bit different because some people might argue that, well, in the same way that we learned in COVID that we can't rely on Chinese makers of pharmaceuticals or whatever,
Sure.
or PPE, you can't really cut off the spigot on solar panels the way you can oil or natural gas, because once you have it, and then you can't turn it off from China the way Saudi Arabia or Venezuela could cut a pipe. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So this is what I mean about vulnerability. And I think the question is more like long-term versus short-term. I think there's a lot we can do just short-term by just taking advantage of low-cost panels that are available and get them on people's roofs and get them out in fields and make a lot of power, and start figuring out the real challenges, which are transmission and getting through a lot of regulation and red tape in the U.S. for building out any new sort of power plant. Those are the real challenges in the United States. It's really hard to put some of these things out because we can't build new transmission. Like that's one of the hardest things to get over. So if we have pressure to a lot of demand to build out these things from, let's say, low cost panels, we're going to have more pressure to fix those problems, and those are the real problems. But when you kind of cut off demand by making panels really expensive, there's less pressure to solve the other problem. So we just kind of the whole system slows down and ends up ultimately costing the consumer more than it would otherwise. So a pure economist would say, like, this is just an incredibly inefficient way to do things. We should just trade with China, and that will lower the cost. And ignoring the job issues, though, would often be the
Sure. Let me play the China hawk here, though, and point out that the Chinese Communist Party commits abuses of Uyghur minorities. Sure. It's a huge surveillance state. They have been harassing our allies in the Pacific. They are stealing our intellectual property. They're highly subsidizing these industries in ways that are unfair on the global competition level. So if we're ever going to, as we move to a green energy economy, if we're allowing China to dominate certain sectors with knowing all those things, and with the subsidies, and with the what many people would call slave labor in some of these sectors, like, they're such a bad actor on the global stage that if anybody is worth combating for what are the technologies of the future, it's them.
Yeah, those are all. I would not disagree with any of those points. So this is an important caveat. Like, those are all true. And so, like, it is slave labor that's happening. So how do we deal with that? That's a big problem. Let me back up and clarify maybe a couple points. So because of those bad actions, we often hear them. That's the only thing you hear. And so the narrative is often Chinese panels are cheap because of those things. That, like, they're cheap because of slave labor in the supply chain or because of subsidies only. And that's really not true. I mean, yes, those help cost maybe some, but the cost of something like panels or batteries have fallen at such an incredible rate. Like, we continue to over-expect on cost. Every single prediction in the last 5 years of, like, what's the cost going to be in 5 years from now, it's still higher than it actually gets to. It's so much lower than we thought it would be. Those kinds of gains don't come from just low wages, right? In fact, wages in China have been going up. So in other sectors, not the slave labor part, but in manufacturing, just wages in general are actually more expensive now than they used to be. And yet costs are still falling like an exponential rate. So that kind of cost decline, it doesn't come from just subsidies and spending and lowering input costs. It comes from learning and huge innovations on the production line. And so some of these firms are just extremely innovative and entrepreneurial firms who are figuring out new ways to automate something or combine processes and make the same amount of product at the same spec at lower cost. So there's just obsession with like cost out manufacturing, and that's something that those firms are exceptionally good at, that's the real reason they have a competitive edge. Okay, so I want to get that out there, because if you don't know that, or if you don't believe that, then it's very easy to just say, oh, it's just a cost thing. So we just put up tariffs and then we'll make them here. Like, so easy. But that's not so easy, because we don't have all that know-how. Like, we don't have the workforce, thousands of really skilled technicians and production engineers who are intimately tied with the makers of the machine that makes the machine. Like, it's like this dense ecosystem of innovation that's focused on production. So again, that's very different from focusing on like upstream R&D. Like, who's going to make the next gen solar cell that's 5 times more efficient than today's? That's probably going to come out of like a DOE lab in the US. But who's going to manufacture that on a scale and at cost? That's something that we're not so great at. Like, we don't have a lot of that skill set, and they do. So that's the real reason. So I want to put that out there, because it's often not emphasized and like poorly understood. It makes it seem so simple that why can't we just make it here? Okay, but let's talk about the real problems. The slave labor is horrible, but I also think you need to recognize, like, why is that happening? It wasn't like the solar manufacturers went to the government and was like, hey, can you enslave these people so we can get lower cost silicon? No, it was like the government is just going to repress this region because they're going after these people who they don't want. And it is a political motive. So if we were able to somehow cut that out of the supply chain, let's say we make silicon and we make it cheaper and we can ship it to China, they would still enslave people. Like, the human rights abuses are not happening because of economic motives, I will say, right? That's the main point. So this is like I don't have an answer, which is really disappointing. Like, I don't think we have a lot of tools that we can use to fix that problem. It's happening because of internal political reasons that the CCP wants, and we only have economic levers here to try to put pressure on them, but that's not going to change the fact that they're going to still repress those people.
Is this just one of those shitty geopolitical realities that you have to choose between the world burning and supporting slave labor?
No, I hope not. So I think we do have some options here. I mean, so certainly. So you hear some really like crazy ideas. People are like, well, we need to reduce the global population. That's how we're going to fix climate change. And I'm just like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Like, the whole point of the only reason climate change is a problem is because it threatens humans. It threatens our existence. So if like humans dying is the solution, it sort of seems like we're not solving the real problem. So no one wants to.
It also threatens animals.
Yeah, and others, right? But I mean, I think we're all self-absorbed here. Like, we want our own survival at the end of the day.
I think there's some people out there that would probably be like.
But that's also self-fulfilling. I mean, if by saving our ecosystems, it saves us. I mean, we're in the same planet together, and
I'm with you.
So no one wants, like, I will never say like slave labor is the way forward so we can get to the green revolution. Like, that's just horrible. And my frustration with it is, we can't change it. I don't think we have a lot of power to change it. So, I mean, there may be some creative solutions. Like, we did have a strong polysilicon industry in America. We were actually the biggest in the world for a little bit, like 2010 or so. And Obama's administration put tariffs on Chinese panels, and the retaliatory tariffs were put on our polysilicon. So our industry collapsed. So basically, because of our tariffs, the retaliation to it destroyed our polysilicon industry as a supplier to solar, and China went over and started getting it locally over in Xinjiang. So we could try to revamp that. I mean, we could try to boost up and subsidize the heck out of our polysilicon manufacturers and build up that capability and try to get under the cost and say, hey, I want you guys to buy from us. Right? But imagine what that would require. That would require us to trade with China, right? We would have to lower our barriers and go to Chinese suppliers and say, I want you to buy our polysilicon because it's clean. And if you buy, even if it costs a little more, if you buy from us and you make the panels, I'll buy the panels from you. And now there's an incentive there to say, you know what, we're not going to use the slave labor thing. Something like that I have no idea if that would work.
But have a better chance than saying we're not going to trade.
Just
with
putting
you,
up a barrier and saying, okay, well, we're not going to buy them, so our hands are clean. Well, those panels are still going to be made and shipped somewhere else. So the slave labor is not changing. That's not a solution to the problem.
Does that not kind of follow along with the China approach that was the conventional wisdom up until the last, 10 years? Was that like if we normalize trade with China, they'll come be a part of the global community and act more appropriately on the global stage? And that proved to be wrong?
I don't know if anyone ever believed that was going to happen, but maybe we were hopeful. Maybe under...
People at least said they believed that was going to happen.
Under Hu Jintao and Obama, maybe those were sort of the height of our relationship. It's been sort of on a decline since. I'm not sure. I think I can go back in my mind and remember, being in Beijing in 2008 during the Olympics and the energy then, and almost sort of being, I guess, maybe naive at the time, but thinking almost certainly this is going to become a democratic country. Like, it just seemed like that was definitely going to happen. Like, the relations with the West and trade were doing so well. There was a lot of positive momentum in that direction. Things were opening up even more. And then it just kind of went hard in the opposite direction. So I was very kind of surprised at where we are now, looking back at who I was back then.
Do you have any thoughts on why that is?
Oh man, what's gone on in I mean, a lot of it's on both sides here, but let's talk about maybe the China side. I mean, Xi Jinping took power and is someone a little bit obsessed with that, and is sort of taken a philosophy of just even more command and control and not opening up the economy. And he's sort of turning off the spigot of the growth engine that's been China for the last 30 years. So people are questioning whether that's the best strategy for China's success going forward. But for whatever reason, he's in charge and he's consolidated his power. So there's something of an obsession over power consolidation. But we've had our own retaliatory reactions to some of the real things that we've lost to China. So the job losses in these key sectors like steel, those hurt. And there were a bunch of communities who said, I don't like this. I'm not voting for this. And have moved politically against China. For again, you can't fault them for that, right? So we ended up with a president like Trump, who was and still is just extremely hostile to China. Like, China bad is basically like the number one hashtag for like every other word he says. Mm-hmm. And so when we
Democrats
had,
too,
but now it's a political coalition. It's like everyone seems to agree that just everything China
the other side.
Yeah.
Even with everything that Biden announced the other day, it was like Trump was like, oh, now he's listening to me, but he's not going far enough. So I mean,
yeah, this is
like
so this was a bit of a surprise. Maybe I shouldn't have been, but I was not expecting Biden to go this hard in a direction of sort of anti-China everything. But I can at least understand it. So, I can understand there's one logic here, which I think there's something to this, which is that I'm wanting an optimal future, but we have to be realistic that when you live in a democratic country, you often have to compromise and settle on suboptimal to have anything, right? So like the IRA bill is a great example of this. The IRA bill, if we had a future with or without the IRA, I would still choose the one with it. I think it's mostly a huge success for climate. It's the biggest climate bill in U.S. history for sure. But it has a lot of things tied to it that are sort of anti-China, right? Like, we cannot buy battery materials, even the upstream materials from China or Chinese suppliers for various reasons. I mean, you could, but it would be too expensive. So that kind of ties our hands of our automakers. They have to find someone else, and there's really no one else, and so costs are going to be high. So that's something I don't like. That to me is going to slow things down. But the political reality of that is that's something that both Republicans and Democrats agreed on, which is, when's the last time that happened in this country? So if we can get to even if it's slower, but still a mostly moving in the right direction towards a greener future, and we have agreement, then maybe we have to just accept that.
Well, and there's also this notion that comes along with that is forcing all these components to be made in the United States eventually will build out these factories all across middle America, and then you get buy-in from these communities, whereas you might not be able to sell them on, hey, let's tackle this problem of climate change, but do you really want to close down this factory that's making, EVs or whatever?
Right. So this is the whole, the sort of Republican talking points that basically all green tech is bad was pretty popular for a very long time until people in red states started realizing that there was a huge industry here, especially in things like wind. Like Texas is the biggest wind and solar market in the country, and they're just booming. And so people are kind of waking up to this and being like, hey, this is great for us, man. And also, by the way, putting these wind turbines in, Americans are putting them in. You can't outsource that job. It has to be done here. So this is great for us. I'm not against this, So we're building a coalition now where maybe it isn't so bad after all. Maybe there is going to be some bipartisan support for green tech. And if we can get agreement on that, and both parties can say, hey, I'm gonna support investing in those technologies, and especially the R&D for the next generation of those things, I'll still take that. I think that's a far better situation than where we were maybe even 10 years ago, where it was Republican senators bringing snowballs into Congress in summer or April and being like, look, climate change isn't real because it's cold today.
Well, because that's been some of the, I think there's been some complaints, I think, across the board of the pace of the rollout of some of these demands in the IRA. And because of all these requirements, you're not really getting the adoption that you would want. And it's kind of moving slowly. And the other side of that is, and that's because of all these requirements, right?
Yeah, so I think there's maybe different ways to have done this. I mean, again, we had to compromise. So maybe where we landed is the compromise. But I think there were more strategic approaches that I would like to see. And my only hope is that, even though the measures that are put in place, which maybe we should clarify that because I don't know who's listening and at what time in the future or history, but huge tariffs were just put in place, right? The Biden administration just put 100% import tariff on an EV from China. It's historically massive. Even China never went that high with U.S. imports to China. So it's a pretty big, and a bunch of other things too.
It's another example of this whole thing. It's Matt, how great would it be for climate if we could have $10,000 EVs in the U.S.? I mean, that would be great. Everybody would have one, right? I mean, that would be.
It'd be great.
And they say they're pretty good cars.
Yeah, they're great cars.
Why are they so cheap? And I know, obviously, they are really good at making things, but environmental standards and working conditions and intellectual property and all these things. I guess one question. Let's get to the latest round and talk about what happened recently.
Sure.
With the new announcement of Biden tariffs, and we're at May 17th for everyone. Is it May 17th? So things will change. But on May 17th, 2024, the biggest, and this applies to solar panels as well, but what everyone's talking about is the EVs, 100% tariffs. Yeah. Would you say that these EVs are so cheap and so apparently good because of what is the combination? I know we talked about the solar panels. You said it was mostly because of their manufacturing prowess. Is that the same here, or can there be a good argument to be made that they're so cheap because of the China, the government subsidizes steel or whatever, cheating?
Yeah. I read the press release from Biden's press release on the other day on this, and the word unfair was mentioned 16 times in 20 minutes. It was kind of crazy, but there was zero mention of anyone in China making good cars, right? It was just they're cheating and their cars are cheap because they're cheating, which is just so not true. It's just not true.
The American workers are better.
So I mean, let's get into this. So China's automotive industrial policy has always been focused on making better gas cars. They've wanted their own GM or Toyota or Volkswagen forever. And they put up really extreme industrial policies to try to make that technology transfer. Automakers had to go to China and make a joint venture. They couldn't own more than 50% of the joint venture. They had to share their intellectual property with them. I mean, it was just basically give me everything. And what happened from that? None of them really got good at making cars. The foreign automakers were actually still really great at controlling the underlying know-how, because a lot of that know-how is really tacit. So they did very well there. Foreign automakers, through their joint ventures, still completely dominate China's auto industry. For the last 20 years, it's every brand you see on the street was foreign brands, just made locally. And the Chinese firms never really learned. But during this whole time, there's all these other little private companies that kind of popped up, like this little known company called BYD that started making cars way back in 2003, privately owned, invested by Warren Buffett, an entrepreneurial little battery company who saw, I think I can put my batteries in cars, so I'm going to go after an EV. And people laughed at them for a long time, and now they have amazing cars. So the most successful firms in China are not the big state-owned industries. It's the private entrepreneurial firms like BYD and Geely and these companies who have decided to engage with automakers in the West, learn from them, take their cars, break them down, and figure out how they're made and make it on their own. And they are going in a totally different direction. So what the skill set it requires to make good batteries and good motors and really good software and battery management systems, that's a whole different skill set that no one's really mastered. I mean, you could argue that Tesla got there a little bit earlier, but they made luxury cars. I mean, they didn't get there at cost. I mean, they were making very expensive cars for a very long time, still pretty expensive. BYD has slowly learned and made better cars. So there's nothing magical, I think, about what's happened necessarily. It's just that they've had investment and nobody telling them that climate change isn't real. And they've had, local government support to do a lot of early things like buy taxis and buy buses from them and provide some demand to get them started. And now 20 years later, they have great cars. So I don't think it's something that like they have perfected. Like it's not like we can't make good EVs either. I just think that we haven't focused on it anywhere near as much. And they have had more government support for a much longer period of time and really no one else going after it. Like GM has been there for 20 years. They could have made an EV in China. They chose not to because they were making crazy profits in their gas cars. And they didn't want to share their intellectual property on EVs with China. They wanted to just keep that here and focus on the US market. So
you disagree with the president that the unfairness is the reason why these cars are so cheap?
No, so I would say you could have taken the same exact set of like Chinese industrial policies and put them in other countries. Like, I don't know, let's say Brazil or Mexico. And you would not have gotten a company like BYD probably. I don't think you would have had the same outcome because they have much smaller auto industries in general. Like the number of auto firms in China is just crazy. And there's so much engineering know-how across all these different firms that there's a very talented labor force there that has a lot of know-how. They know how to design cars, they know how to build the bodies, and you also have all these other pieces you need for an EV, battery makers and the electronics industry there, all these, and software engineers. I mean, just all the ingredients are there in this huge ecosystem. And it just took a few independent sort of entrepreneurial firms to kind of pick up and take off. So I think that's still maybe painting it even maybe too rosy for China, but just giving a different perspective than what you hear often in the news media. It's not all unfair stuff. It's a lot of the exact same policies that other countries have used in the past. Japan did this, South Korea did this, and they, over many, many years, developed strong competitive players. I think we had our chance to also do the same, and we just haven't. I mean, we, the collective Western automakers, have not pursued investment in EVs until now that we see a threat. So I think we could have done more. I think our best chance was probably way back in maybe, let's say, 2008, under the financial crisis then, if we had maybe tied some of those bailout dollars to like requirements to really invest in batteries and things like that, we might have had a chance of being more competitive today. But now we're very much behind. I mean, we're on our back feet here, and we've got to figure out either how to make competitive EVs like they are or fail, I think. I mean, this is going to be the future of the auto sector. So we either figure it out or we partner with them and do it together. Is this another?
I mean, do you have any fear about the environmental implications of these tariffs? Because I mean, I think the announcement means there will be less EVs on the road in 5 or 10 years, unless do you agree with that? And also, what I was trying to get to is I thought it was interesting. You saw some like environmental organizations coming out in support of the announcement, and I thought that
like Sierra Club, I believe, said that they're for it, basically. And that's kind of a puzzling one because I do think it ultimately means that making making an EV in the US will cost more and be slower to market than it would be without them. And it's not necessarily because of I'm not talking about just importing Chinese-made EVs. I'm talking about the other things like the materials. So I would love to see a future where BYD builds a plant somewhere in America with a US firm. Ford and BYD get together somewhere, we make the batteries, you make the EVs, we make a killer car that's lower cost than you could do on your own. That's Tesla's model, by the way. I mean, they don't make, it's a Panasonic battery. It's a Japanese firm that is over here making a Japanese battery in a American firm out in Nevada, American plant out in Nevada that's employing lots of Americans. So, why couldn't we have that?
And that's been talked about, that they're going to figure out a way to get the cars in through some kind of joint venture or producing them.
But
in
how?
Mexico.
I mean, so my question for this is, how do you get around these tariffs though? Because the tariffs are on the raw materials. So if you're talking about a BYD plant here, you're going to expect that BYD is going to say, well, I'm going to get my lithium from the same refinery in China, right? They're going to have to be told, no, you have to buy them from somewhere else. So whether a Chinese player is going to be willing to do that or not is we'll see. But I think there are other ways to have gone forward here where we and maybe this is a hope that like even with these tariffs in place today, that we can see future legislation that finds carve-outs for partnerships so we can move forward. So let's say we keep the tariff on the EV from China, but if you are making a joint venture with a Chinese firm and it's employing X number of Americans, we'll allow you to use Chinese minerals. I mean, I feel like you have to do something like that if we want to have if we want to be serious at all about speed to market. Otherwise, I really don't know where these things are going to come from because the material supply chain is almost entirely concentrated in China. So the timeline for that to scale up, let's say, manganese refineries outside of China, many, many years. Like this is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. So tariffs are up like now. Some of these things are immediately effective. Some of them are 2 years from now. That's still not quite enough time. So I'm just hoping that we'll find exceptions and exclusions, and hopefully you'll hear automakers being more and more willing to step forward and say, all right, if you want me to make this thing, I got to make some concessions somewhere, because it's going to be hard for them to do it completely with nobody else.
What is the current state of play in the mining and materials portion of this whole equation? Because that's something a few years ago that was getting talked a lot about, is like the cobalt mines in Africa and how terrible the conditions were, and that China is dominating the quest to secure these essential materials for producing this technology. Where are we at now? And I also remember seeing a lot of assessments that said that basically like there's not enough of these materials to build out the required amount of EVs that we need to move away from fossil fuels for transportation.
So I don't think that's necessarily true. There's certainly enough materials around the world. It's there. There's supply is not necessarily a problem. It's refinement is sort of, I think, the bigger issue. So most of the materials are not actually all sourced directly in China. Like lithium is coming from Australia and Chile and other places around the world, but they ship them to China to do the refining and processing to get it into sort of battery grade material so that it can then go into a battery production facility. So that's the sort of bigger choke point. And so China is kind of the controller of that. So it's more like refineries. Like, where are you going to see refineries? And that, again, is something that we don't have to do here to make an impact. Like, we don't have to say it has to be refined in Kentucky or somewhere. I mean, like, why not work with or go to Chile and build a better relationship with them and say, hey, if you, like, we're going to help you build refineries here. Get our State Department out there and start building our relations with and say, you guys mine this stuff here. It's better for you if you also refine it here. You can inject yourself into a higher value. Instead of just being an extractionary industry, you can also add some value there and then ship it up to an American plant, and we just cut China out, right? Like, there's some strategic things like that you could do. It doesn't necessarily have to all be made here and re-onshored in America. There's kind of an obsession of that. And also, by the way, is that really an area you want to be competitive in? Like, it's very hard to be competitive in material refinement. I mean, again, super razor thin margins, like not a very high value add thing. Designing the software for the car is much more value add. Like, let's focus on that and get the materials from somewhere else. So there's just a lot of things like that are just sort of kind of silly in the thinking. But let's talk about some of those other things you mentioned. I mean, like the Congo and again, like horrible practices there, child labor in cobalt. I think, fortunately, in that case, the industry itself is sort of moving away from cobalt-based battery chemistry. So lithium iron phosphate, LFP, which BYD is sort of one of the bigger pioneers of that, is kind of coming back. As it was there for a while. A lot of companies kind of moved away from it, but it's kind of coming back. There's a lot of advantages to it now that we're seeing that we didn't maybe appreciate before. And there's different types of batteries. Often the kind of trade-offs are sort of how much energy density can you get, like how much energy can you store per, size. Take a milk jug. How much electricity can I store in that amount of space? And you need that to be really dense for it to work in transportation, right? So different chemistries have those trade-offs, and there were some other chemistries that were kind of doing a little bit better, but they have fire problems, and they have this cobalt problem. They require cobalt. So lithium iron phosphate, it's all pretty easy materials to find around the world. They're not as geographically concentrated like in Africa. So we can have a better oversight over, where is this coming from and is it being ethically sourced and things. So, I want to underscore this like the whole time that in every one of these things, we do have to make sure that there's like ethical sourcing here, all right? And if it isn't happening, we got to try to find a way to get around it. I just am sort of critiquing that. I think a lot of the tools we're trying to use don't really do anything for solving that problem. I think we have to be a little more creative. And some of them I'm just sort of kind of stuck where I'm like, I don't know what to do about that problem. Like the Xinjiang thing, again, that's going to happen no matter what's going on in any industry. And by the way, there's labor from there in other sectors too, but it's not just solar. But that's happening for political, not economic reasons. So, but for batteries, I think there's more hope. There's a lot more diverse chemistries out there, and it's still a very active R&D space, right? There's new chemistries. There's sodium-ion batteries now that we're seeing, again, in China. And that looks very promising. There's lithium-air batteries that I've heard coming out of Argonne National Lab. They're talking a lot about that as maybe a potentially really impactful chemistry. So the chemistries we see 10 years from now might be completely different from today even. So some of this stuff is dynamic. It is changing. But I think at the end of the day, you still need automakers making these things and making them affordable. And you have to have demand at the end of the line. You have to have people wanting to buy these cars. And if all we're able to produce is like an expensive EV, then there's a very limited market that you can get to. And we've seen that. Most of the EVs we sell, the US has a lot of sales. If you look at like the top 10 sellers globally in volumes, GM is up there, and so is like some of the other, like Nissan with the Leaf. But they're not necessarily affordable cars in the sense that like compared to like a Chinese EV and some of the EVs over there. So most Americans are facing a choice between a moderately expensive or very expensive EV or a pretty affordable gas car. And that's where the majority of Americans live, is that bottom part where that's all I can afford, man. So I have to buy that. So that's what we really, really need. We need a $20,000 EV new. And if I see that, I'll be thrilled. So if 5 years from now we have one of those, and it's made in a plant in America.
Well, you might be able to have a
Detroit,
100% tariff on a $10,000 car and still make it and still be cheaper than a Tesla.
This is the point. So this was sort of one of the laughing points, was like the tariff had to be so high because that's how far behind we are in terms of just making a low cost EV. Like some of the EVs are only $12,000, $15,000, so it might only be $25,000 to $30,000. That's as competitive with a Nissan Leaf maybe. So with 100% tariff and no subsidy, you still might be able to get a cheaper EV from China. And let's also recognize that there are ways around this. It's going to be a constant game of whack-a-mole. Now that we've entered this, world of we're just going to do industrial policy in the most extreme ways of just huge, tariffs and starting sort of trade wars. Which again, not starting, like this has been going on for a decade now, but just continuing to ratchet up a trade war here. It's going to be a constant game of trying to get around that. Like, there's been a lot of critique that a lot of Chinese solar plants, they just moved their manufacturing to like Malaysia, and now we buy panels from Malaysia. And so it's like, have we really been, doing anything here or not? People will say, well, we're not importing at all from China. I'm like, well, we kind of are. They're just coming through Malaysia. Like, it's not super effective. It's kind of a blunt tool, and it's not always.
It's a lot of politics.
But it's also right. Not always offering the same protections that you might think. So I'll just say, like, this is giving our automakers a chance to have a little bit of cushion, a little bit of protection, but they've got to jump on this now. And they have been. So this is not all a doom and gloom story. The IRA bill, again, did put huge incentives and a lot of money behind manufacturing in the US for EVs. So we're seeing plants go up. There's at least 10, I think, sort of gigascale, like gigafactory type size battery plants that are going to be coming online probably in the next 2-3 years, specifically for the auto sector. So that alone is a pretty promising outcome. And my hope is that they're going to get their costs low enough that it'll result in an EV that's competitive with gas cars. Ultimately, you got to get there. This is the challenge: is cost. And I don't doubt we can make a good EV. I've ridden in a ton of different American EVs. They're great. They just cost like $40,000 to $60,000, and that's just not acceptable for most Americans. Would also help if we built some high-speed rail. I'm going to throw that one in here too, or other infrastructure that's not just cars. Like trains and buses and other ways of getting around, especially interstate travel that's not only cars. This is another upper hand that both Europe and China has, is that they can make an EV that only has 200 miles of range, and it'll sell great. It's extremely popular. And because it only has 200 miles of range, they can have a lower price. It's a smaller battery because they don't need to drive across states. No one would ever drive from like Beijing to Shanghai. That's madness. You can take a train in 4.5 hours for $50. I mean, imagine going from New York to Chicago for $50 in like 4.5 hours. Just be unbelievable. But we don't have anything like that. If you can't afford a flight, you got to drive for like 2 days.
Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to maybe like bring this home by talking a little bit about your experiences in China. And I think most people in the United States don't know a Chinese person that like lives in China and knows like their hopes and dreams and desires and how they see the world. I just wonder, like from your perspective, almost like what are Chinese people like? I feel like they're kind of demonized in our society. What are they like, and how do they see their future in these kind of issues that we're talking about?
Yeah, I'll say I have almost never met a Chinese person that matches the popular image that I would say our politicians maybe sort of put out there. There's when we need to recognize the same for us too. Like, how are we perceived around the world? A lot of people aren't super friendly towards Americans or America, but the individual people you meet are just normal people. I mean, they're just like us. I mean, they're in so many ways they're just normal people who just want a lot of the same things we want. Basic security, access to good housing, a job, and basic safeties and basic needs. I mean, I don't. It's this idea that they're I don't know, just that their values are only aligned with the CCP, for example, is just not necessarily true at all. And when you're in any major city, there it feels just kind of like you're in a lot of any other cities. I mean. And also it's a pretty competitive place. Like, it's a very competitive place, just like here. Industries here are super competitive, and so are they over there. It's very much a sort of capitalist thing on the ground, day to day. It's how do I get resources and how do I compete to win? So a lot of that is sort of the business ecosystems. They feel kind of similar.
Do they want democracy? Do they want freedom? Do they?
I don't know. That one, I almost avoid talking about this a lot because it's such a dicey thing. I don't want to talk about this, especially when I'm over there. I just don't want to talk about that. But I would say that.
Is that like a topic of conversation?
No,
all the time?
I rarely talk about this. We
are always arguing about politics.
Yeah, I rarely talk about this. I mean, and I often don't talk about politics with my friends and families either here. For a lot of the same reasons. It just makes people pissed off, and no one wants to. It's not the things that actually matter at the end of the day. A lot of the day-to-day things are like your relationships with people. That's the things that matter. That's what we want to talk about. So it's the kind of same thing over there. I don't feel like it's impossible to ever know if there's like a bunch of people who want a democratic future because they could say so anyway if they wanted to. So that's sort of an impossible thing to find out. And I wouldn't want to put friends of mine in harm's way by bringing that up all the time and be like, so what do you think about democracy? I'm like, that's not something I'm going to bring up in a place like China. It could get them in trouble. Even if they liked the idea, they're probably not going to want to talk about it. I will say what we talk about is, the same things we talk about. I mean, all the things we just talked about, I would say most people would probably kind of agree with. They'd be like, yeah, that's it. Climate change is a problem. Like, we need to figure this out. They would like to have good relations with us, and they would like to have a successful future where both of our countries are at peace with each other. Like, no one wants conflict with China. And like fundamentally, if we want to have any future as a habitable planet for humans, like, that's like the number one thing we have to avoid. Like, a war with China, like a full-on live-fire war, would just be utterly disastrous. And I mean, it would make everything that's ever happened in the past just look like just child's play. Like, the potential for human loss is just you can't even imagine, I think. So we have to avoid that. And so we can have our trade battles, we can have our trade wars, but at the end of the day, we have to keep talking with each other. We have to keep our diplomatic ties very open, so that we don't end up in accidental conflict. Like, when you stop talking to people, you just start imagining what they're saying in your head, and you're like, they hate me, they think these things, and you go off on this really dark path, and it's not often what's happening. So that's one of my bigger fears from the rising tensions, is just that everything kind of falls with that there's symbolic actions like kicking people out of embassies and things, and that just cuts the communication channel. That's very dangerous, especially when tensions are high. So I'm hoping we can maintain dialogue. That's why I'm going back next week. I'm talking with some universities. I'm going to Fudan University. I'm a professor. I'm not representing the U.S. government, but I'm at least talking with other people thinking about these problems. And we're going to be talking exactly about these, about green technology and U.S.-China relations, and how are we going to navigate this future. So we got to keep talking about it. We can't make I think too crazy rash actions and not communicate with each other.
What do you think is going to happen in this relationship in China? Where are we headed?
Okay, I'll maybe just talk about my hopes here. I'm still going to remain optimistic for the most part. Maybe the best case scenario is that all of these policies actually work for us, that we start making good tech, and we start actually being competitive in a lot of these sectors. That puts pressure on Chinese firms to compete, and then maybe trade barriers fall because we can be exposed to that competition now, right? So I think, that if that's what has to happen, the barriers are not going to come down. They're politically up, and that's where they're going to be. So they're not going to come down until we feel safe at home. So let's say we get there, we start making good stuff, we start trading, and then we get back to where we are basically now with the gas car market. We're incredibly linked up in gas cars, by the way. So many of the components in those cars come from China, oil filters and exhaust pipes and all these things. So maybe we get to that point where we continue to engage with each other and remain linked as trade partners, and we steer the course, hopefully, to a greener future. That's what I think that's actually very possible. I don't think that's a crazy future. That's a very possible future, and we just can't get lazy. If we get an opportunity, if our automakers get an opportunity to jump in these sectors and start making stuff, they have to go full bore on this, and they got to do everything they can to get competitive. They're pretty far behind. So that's my hope. I think we can do it. Of course, there are individual things that can happen that can steer the whole thing awry, like a change of power in one way or another. Like, what if Xi Jinping has a heart attack? What's the transition going to be like? There actually isn't a plan right now for that, by the way, and that's kind of concerning. What if Trump wins this fall? That's going to be a very different future for all these policies that were just placed. I don't know how that's going to go. So there are some global events that can happen that can kind of shift things in a major way. But I think my hopeful future that I just kind of mentioned it's not an impossible future. I think you can even navigate some of those outcomes. I don't think the people who say war is inevitable kind of thing is actually inevitable at all. I don't think that's even necessarily a likely future. I think both sides recognize just how catastrophic that would be and how not self-serving that would be. And so I think they both have self-incentives here to avoid that outcome, which, it's kind of how the Cold War went for a long time. And we found ways to de-escalate and, reduce our nuclear arsenals and get out of that over many, many years. So what we need is just more people who kind of know what's actually happening. The political rhetoric around this stuff is very dangerous, because when you're just like, well, they're unfair, they're cheating, and they're stealing all our stuff, that's it. Then of course, your reaction to that is, well, all right, let's just put up all the barriers and just we got to fight them now. They're the enemy. That's not the whole history at all of how this has happened. And I'm not going to say that they aren't stealing IP. They are. All right, but IP is not the reason they're competitive. Let's just recognize that again, right? Because you have the blueprints to how to make a solar panel doesn't mean you know how to make them or make them at cost. So we need people to know what's actually happening, and I don't think it serves us well to not tell that whole truth. Like, I mean, the press release, for example, could have been, we're putting up these tariffs because we've been outcompeted. I mean, you could have just put that motivation forward and been like, yes, they have been doing some unfair practices, and we have found that, and that's true, right? They have been subsidizing things, and we haven't been. So now they've gotten ahead of us. And by the way, the top 10 players are all over there. They all make low-cost products, and no one is competitive with them. This is our chance to get competitive, so we're going to put up our barriers. I mean, you could see that narrative going, and it's the same exact motivation to put the same thing up, but you could have told more of the whole truth instead of just painting them as the enemy in all ways. And it's not necessarily the enemy in all ways. So that kind of rhetoric is just politically convenient to use, but it's not really the whole truth. And there's this huge difference between the firms on the ground doing the work and the government and what they want for our future. I don't know if I answered anything in a long-winded sort of soliloquy there.
I think I don't really have any other questions. I was wondering if there's anything that I didn't ask that you were like, man, I wish you would have talked about.
I really wanted to emphasize the history here, and I think we're moving into this new era where like industrial policy is okay again to do in the future. Maybe that's worth mentioning. That like we did this before. By the way, another history lesson here. Like my analogy I like to point out is space. Like the U.S. completely dominates space in like every way, like the technology, actual control of space, and like putting people on the moon, enormous projects like the James Webb Telescope. I mean, like this is a U.S. thing, and the only company who's ever come along to do anything privately is SpaceX, and they've been crushing it. Another American firm. That was industrial policy all the way, man. Like, we went real full bore on that. We spent a lot of money federally funding places like NASA and training a lot of people to build those up. So we've done industrial policy in the past, and we were successful. And for a long time, it kind of disappeared, and it was a taboo word you couldn't talk about, and free markets were the only way. So we're kind of moving back in this industrial policy is okay again mode, because we see again another real threat. So it's kind of an interesting thing that like we've done it before, and we have succeeded. Are we going to succeed again now? I don't know, but this is not necessarily a new territory for the U.S. politically. So it's going to be interesting to see how like this all shakes out and how different Democratic and Republican parties realign themselves around this, because we've done it now. So now you've got to either go with it or I don't know what you would do. You kind of have to go on board with this. It's kind of the ship is moving in this direction now. So.
Yeah, that's a huge impact of Donald Trump on our politics, basically, right? I mean, he almost single-handedly moved the Republican Party to a pro-tariff party when. Well,
so I mean, Obama started it.
Right.
I'll say, at least in solar, I mean, he put tariffs on.
This was like, well, that's the thing. I'm saying this is something that Democrats were more likely to do.
Yeah, it's true that the sort of pro-labor camp was always more prone to say, let's put tariffs up to support our jobs and to support labor unions. And that was always more of a Democratic political move. And yeah, a lot of those factories were in Republican states, though. And so I think that's kind of where it kind of hit home. And people came forward and said, hey, this is we lost everything, and this is not okay. And so the Republican Party kind of had to get on board with that too. So it's interesting. Everyone's fighting over being pro-labor now, which is, I mean, again, one of the bigger motives for why this tariff happened now. I mean, there's no, I don't think anyone's fooled. Hopefully you're not fooled by the fact that, like, it's middle of May, we're like a few months away from the election, and this is when we're putting the tariffs up to be pro-labor. Like, Biden needs the labor union votes, so that's not lost on anybody. But like everyone's fighting over labor now, they're, and trying to say, hey, I'm the one who supports labor more than the other guy. That's an interesting turn. We haven't seen that in a bit.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, cool, man. John, this has been great.
Thanks.
I really
This was
enjoyed the
fun.
conversation.
Yeah.
This was super interesting. So thanks so much for coming by, and I appreciate you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.